Thrilled to be here. I appreciate the opportunity, Plato.
Yeah, and also there's a lot of good questions already popping up in the Q&A, so please upvote them and ask us again questions. But before we go into the Q&A, I would love to kick it off with a question around career tracks. So what is your thoughts on the two different career tracks commonly found in tech companies, the Facebooks and the Dropbox of the world, who see technical leadership and people management as almost like a lateral move, and you get equal pay, and as you gain skills and experience, you kind of get the promotion. And then there's a more of a traditional approach where you scale up as individual contributor or as an engineer to a certain point, and then you kind of transition yourself into the people management track to get better comp. And I would love to kind of hear your thoughts, approach, and your philosophy around that.
Yeah, appreciate it, John. So the three places I've worked as a grown-up, and I'm unusual in that I've sort of not had as much breadth of experience over 22 years as most people would have in the industry. I've only been VMware, Facebook, and Slack. And all three of those places embraced a parallel ladder, where management and engineering, directly have one-to-one correspondences in terms of comp and leveling and so on. So, and the reasoning behind that, which is sort of diffused into a lot of other places now, and it's close to sort of standard operating procedure as you scale a company these days. The reasoning there is that you don't want to have somebody making the decision to enter management because that's the only way they see to move forward, right? Because there's no other way for them to grow or for them to improve their, their scope or their influence. There's a kind of perception. So I think there's a broad understanding that that's why that gets set up. But I think there's a perception, especially outside of engineering, that we engineers could probably be a little more sensitive to. That the reason that is set up that way for that role and not for accounting or sales or lots of other roles is because engineers are such precious little people and their skills are so in demand and their comp is so high or whatever. And I this could be sort of my vanity as an engineer. You should call me on it if you think that's true. But I think the reason that we do that for engineers is because they actually can have their impact be scaled in ways other than managing larger teams. In sort of a typical mid-20th century, Fordist manufacturing company or something, the only way for me to, let's say we make jeans, right? And I'm an individual contributor at the jeans factory. I take piles of denim, I sew them into jeans, The only way for me to have 100 times the impact I would have as an individual, maker of jeans isn't going to be to get 100 times better at making jeans, right? There's no way for me no matter how new the one person is and how experienced the other person is, the gap's not going to be that big. And while the skill gap is also not as big for programmers, problem selection and the ability to kind of put better tools in the hands of everybody else in your company, and the ability to move the company up the value chain and the problems it's able to address, is actually something that technologists can do. So I'm a believer that sort of parallel track for technologists in a tech-driven company, right? If your business is actually driven by technology, makes sense. And it's not just sort of a bone that we throw to precious engineers.
Great, that makes total sense. Engineers have the capacity and ability to make real scalable impact, even though that they're simply working in the more of a senior or individual contributor role. So that makes total sense. And there are a lot of good questions out there, but kind of related to some of those, to lead into that question, you specifically chose to take the senior, kind of the technical leadership track instead of the people management track. So what would be the advice for some of these aspiring engineers out there? What are the factors to consider? How do you get to a decision, and what is your advice on making that career choice?
Right. So, and I'm often asked this question, by the way, and I think there's a way of answering this question from hindsight, which I'll do. But then I want to modify it in a second. So, why did I choose to stay in technology instead of management? It just seemed like I always had more of an opportunity to have impact and influence by building new things and by changing how we were solving problems than I did by making organizational adjustments or making process improvements or keeping people happier, or any of the sort of other functions that are more specialized to management. And I was also partly just blessed to have talented, motivated, and skilled partners on the management side throughout my career. So it would be, I'm not sure what it would have been like if I found myself in a real vacuum of management capability. It could be that if, to be clear, like I'm not some sort of anarchist, like you need managers, you need good managers, and they make a really big difference. I don't think I'd have had anything like the success in my career that I've had without a bunch of managers along the way. But I was always sort of blessed to have somebody around who was obviously more capable and more motivated than me to get good at managing. It could be that if I saw that as a real vacuum, I'd have changed my track along the way. And this, to some extent, this dovetails with the latter question too. But like the way that this question gets asked, there's usually a latent assumption that you're at a fork in the road at some point, right? That sort of one day in your mid 30s, you wake up and you've been doing this programming thing for a while, and you know the ghost of Christmas past comes to you in a dream and says like, do you want to go into management or do you want to continue down the IC path? And it doesn't have to be a dire sort of one-way door that way, at least in a lot of companies. And I'd encourage companies to set things up in that way if they don't do so already. Lots and lots of places will let you kind of try before you buy as a manager in one way or another. And if you kind of go there and bounce back a little bit, that can be okay. It can get a little weird if you're in a place with, if you're very senior on one side or the other, and you go back and forth in a place that has a lot of fluidity there. We had some strange experiences at Facebook of people sort of going back and forth from like Facebook's E8 level to being a director or something, right? Which is like a fairly specialized management role and a fairly specialized engineering role. So sometimes you'd sort of be a director with an asterisk or an E8 with an asterisk if that had been your path initially. But worst case, people find their level in the new track and it all works out usually. So I would encourage people to not view this as like some, gigantic Faustian pact that they need to make the right choice about.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because a lot of people, to your point, see this almost like a once in a lifetime decision where you have to make a decision and stick to it. But having the ability to kind of roll back the changes, I think it makes a lot of sense. And also recently at Sember, we also built that dual career model where engineers can kind of try out the lead or the people management track, and then kind of see it for a month or 3 months and see how it works out. And our people and culture team would kind of dive in, have those conversations, and let the people kind of switch back and forth a little bit. So
how's that been going for you guys at Sunbird, by the way?
It's relatively new to the process because we launched about 4 years ago. So some of the people who joined earlier in the company are now actually stepping up and leading the team kind of organically. And we're using this as an opportunity to really encourage people to seriously consider about their own careers. What are they good at? What do they enjoy doing? What do they find fulfillment in? And some people actually aspire to be the people managers, whereas some people are still trying to figure out, is this the only way up to people manager? We want to kind of almost market internally that no, we actually have a dual career where you can actually still be successful as on the engineering path.
Right.
Cool. We have wonderful questions. So first question, I think I had a lot of upvotes. We are familiar with the tech leader roles, especially like CTOs and architects, but what are the steps that led there from an IC role? Any ideas, comment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for a lot of folks, I got this question a lot when I took the role as chief architect at Slack as well. So like not every company has that role. So first of all, what do you do? And my kind of elevator pitch for it was, well, you're responsible for technical strategy of the company. But then the question is sort of, well, how do you get there? And it feels sort of discontinuous from, I was an engineer here, I was an engineer there, then I had this fancy title somewhere else. I think there are actually sort of some natural progressions in that area. And one of the ones that is usually the first one to get sort of formally, written up and kind of demarcated is tech lead. So even places that don't have tech lead as a defined role, in my experience, for a lot of the higher risk, more technically sophisticated parts of whatever the company is trying to do, there is some de facto cultural understanding that there's a technical leader, right? That there's a person whose day job is sort of writing code, reviewing code, writing specs, reading docs, understanding what's going on in the outside world, and so on, who's responsible for the technical success of this thing. and is more responsible for technical success than other folks. And I think that tech lead role is usually the first. It's varying levels of formality in different companies, right? Some places have, a whole kind of program around it. Some places just start calling you tech lead. But in either way, that's a for a lot of folks, their first sort of real taste of, first of all, not being just part of the rank and file anymore, right? Having people that used to be your peers kind of looking to you for explicit leadership and get you in a different way. And also kind of experiencing some of the kind of strategic responsibilities that that kind of leadership brings to you. I think tech lead to chief architect is not a huge leap. For me, being chief architect, especially when I first got to Slack, didn't feel massively discontinuous from the role I'd been playing at Facebook, which was kind of like tech lead of tech leads at Facebook AI research, right? So maybe, there's a group of maybe 100 or so engineers in lots of different teams, and I was in close contact with their tech leads and kind of was reporting and responsible for technical success up the chain, and wrote code as well. I continued to write code when I first got to Slack. So I think the same way that there's like and almost nobody that I know of, by the way, has a sort of tech lead of tech leads formal designation, but that happens too with big enough places. So I think if that's kind of the progression there at some level. And one of the reasons that it was that I felt it was time for me to leave Slack, by the way, was just that I didn't think I was able to kind of effectively be the person that understands what's going on, down to the nuts and bolts in ways that sort of made technical sense anymore. I had a pretty good grasp on the back end, for instance, but, our iOS team, deciding that their code base has got these problems and should they do this or should they do that? Like that was out of my depth in a million different ways. And that's good. I think that's actually, there's no chief architect of Google. There's no chief architect of Facebook. There's some, organic size where that role stops making sense. And I felt that role stopped making sense at Slack. So, yeah.
That's great.
But, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I just felt like that's a really great sign of like the self-awareness, being able to understand where you are, even within the company that you've been at for such a long time. And I felt like that was a great kind of segue into the next question. But if you want to finish off, like, please do.
No, unless there's something I'm obviously missing here.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of popularity around this question. I completely resonate with this. It's like, as the company grows and you're kind of growing with the company, and I see this problem all the time when the faster the company grows, the companies usually scale exponentially, they call it, and people scale linearly. So how do you like determine you're actually getting stuck at a certain company in terms of career development? And do you actually go look for opportunity somewhere else? Or how do you, and then kind of leading to the next question is like, what are skills you can pick up to get yourself unstuck on that path and actually be able to accelerate again?
That's a great question, yeah. And this is one of those things where I have epistemologically, I try to be very humble about the advice I give, right? I am one person having one particular experience of the industry, over the time that I was in it. But I want to especially emphasize that here because I do think like paths to growth are really heavily individualized, especially as you get more senior to some extent. What makes you valuable and differentiated is the weird path you took. Right. So if you think of sort of there's some mountain you're climbing or something, as you get farther and farther up that mountain, the trails get more poorly marked and more sparse, and they've branched out more, and there are fewer people that have gone exactly the way you've gone, and so on. So when you're starting out in your career, there are these like really clear role models, like people you just admire. You just want to be able to do what they're able to do. You want to learn everything they know, and they start to get thinner as you kind of get more and more senior. But as a whole, the things. I started my career as a specialist, right? I started my career wanting to do things at the hardware-software interface. I wanted to write code that ran in kernels. I liked operating systems a lot. I wanted to work on operating systems. So I learned a lot about those in undergrad. And this was in the 1990s when sort of a lot of Silicon Valley was still computer manufacturers, right? So For me, it felt like the big career decision leaving college was whether to go to Silicon Graphics or Sun, right? There's the big, cool computer manufacturers in the mid-90s, right?
Yeah.
And that part of the industry doesn't exist anymore. Like, it just got destroyed, right? The sort of dot-com crash, yeah, it wiped out all these internet companies, but it also kind of reorganized the whole way that part of the economy works so that there aren't really places that integrate an operating system with a pile of hardware they want to sell you anymore. It is super hard to explain in 2020 how impossible that turn of events seemed, right? Like, manufacturing computers was what tech did for decades at that point.
That's why we were called Silicon Valley.
Right. Yeah. These were manufacturing concerns. They had warehouses and fleets of trucks and stuff, right? But that did happen, and I ended up working at a software company instead, at VMware. And VMware sort of is a weird software company. It's a software company that sells software computers. But it was not the kind of computer company I envisioned myself working at. That sort of narrow specialization from VMware ended up being transferable to Facebook in a way that wasn't very foreseeable at the time, right? I didn't expect to end up working at an internet services company. I had sort of a hardware bigot's view of that stuff, that it was sort of, fluffy, right? That there's something easier about that. And then it turned out Facebook was, starting in 2008 or so, became a systems company, right? Became aware of sort of having all these limitations on its ability to succeed that were coming from pretty low-level stuff, right? They were coming from just how much money it costs to run the site as it existed. And that ended up leading to innovation in storage and networking and, programming languages and databases and all kinds of places that, are thought of as hardcore, right? And Slack is, I think, moving along a similar trajectory. It's a slightly different story because the public clouds come along, right? This crisis, by the way, similar to the dot-com crisis, like, I don't know exactly who it's an extinction event for, right? The computer manufacturers are all dead already. But whatever comes out of this in 4 to 5 years is probably going to be quite different. So the things that have been key for me have been picking up a big new area, right? It was first operating systems. Then when it felt like I'd mined that out a little bit, for a while it was programming languages. It was also information retrieval. I worked on the search backend at Facebook for a few years. And information retrieval is this interesting totalizing view of computing. There are these communities inside of computing that believe they are keepers of a secret, that believe everybody else in computing is doing a poorly specified, under-formalized version of what they're really doing. And so information retrieval's view of the world is everything is search, right? When you run an add instruction onto registers in a computer, you're really searching for some pattern of bits with a particular property. And yeah, you implement it in Silicon in this funny way, but it's search, damn it. And that's kind of their view of things. And it's a surprisingly powerful view. You can get a lot done with that view. Compiler people's view of things is that you're translating formal languages, like you're making equivalent versions of different formal languages. They tend to view people who work in networking as, yeah, you compile TCP/IP into some application format or whatever, right? And so on and so forth. So what's very powerful about having mastery in 2 of those fields is that makes you rare. Like, it's very powerful to sort of have a deep perspective on this thing and that thing. And maybe from the perspective of people who spent their whole lives specializing in one of those fields, you're still kind of a poser. Like, I'm not a real programming language person, right? I can go to the conferences and I can read the papers and I can kind of chat over coffee. Real PL people figure out that I'm kind of a phony pretty quickly. But, first of all, I know my limitations, right? I know when I'm out of my depth there. And I also have harnessed a little bit of their view of the world and been able to apply it in different contexts. So if you find yourself stuck, right? If you find yourself sort of not growing as a technologist, picking up a big new area, even if it seems silly and seems orthogonal to what you do, I think can be really, really fruitful if you're able to find the energy and the time and some excuse to do it. There was also sort of an organizational question in there too about, like, as the company grows, how do you make sure that you're growing along with it? That is an interesting, I'll let you in a little bit of like realpolitik advice here that is something to sort of be aware of, which is, it's true, right? If your company is a little pyramid and it starts off as a little tiny triangle with just, your founders and a couple of employees, right? And this little tiny triangle, if you're really successful and lucky over a decade or so, is going to end up having thousands of nodes in it.
Hmm.
And the vast, vast, vast majority of the growth, just because of the way that these things work, is going to happen in the interior of that triangle. Right? And to some extent, this is like why being a manager is sort of conventional wisdom for a nice growth path, right? Is because that interior of the triangle is kind of managers, right?
Hmm.
That's just the way the math works out. And even in places, by the way, that have parallel ladders, it's really, really rare for the number of distinguished engineers to be comparable to the number of VPs or whatever, right? The world seems to need more of those senior managers than it does the senior technologists. And I think I've seen it in enough places that I don't think it's just pathology, right? I don't think it's just that they're doing it wrong. So as an individual contributor, right, you kind of find yourself in this little, cortex that's about to get inflated, right? You're on the edge of this balloon, and the balloon's about to fill up. And you want to know whether you're on the top side of the balloon or the bottom side of the balloon, because the top side's going to go really, really high, and the bottom side of the balloon's not going to go very far at all. And the only way I know the only way I know of that's repeatable to do that is to kind of keep leveling up your contributions, right? Is to keep doing stuff that is, twice as big a deal when the company's twice as big. There's probably there's lots of other stories of people, succeeding in some weird political way or by, I'm sure it helps to be buddies with founders and all that stuff. Of course, I'd be fools to ignore those stories. It's just, they're not very repeatable and they're not very useful as advice for mortals. So I don't know a shortcut. Sorry.
This is really interesting because I also talk about this topic a little bit because as an engineer background founder, kind of transitioning myself into the business side of things because I wasn't good enough in engineering. I couldn't negotiate myself into coding, or code would not listen to my negotiations. I had to be really accurate.
Right.
So actually, I consider engineering as a really, really accurate form of art almost. One kind of two different ways to look at this was, and I think what you were alluding to earlier was exactly that, was if you're in the optimization theory space or whatnot, there's a problem landscape. It has a lot of hills and valleys, and there's bigger mountains and smaller mountains. You're kind of traversing in that space, trying to figure out what's the right hill to pick. How do I go up to the top of the hill? If it's not the right hill or mountain, you're gonna kind of come back down and figure out the next best hill. And by looking into different, domains, whether it be operating system or information or even things like AI, you're kind of increasing the level of perturbation. So freeing yourself from that exploitation where you're trying to optimize the heck out of the existing hill, you're going to exploring our other spaces, which give you that more of a holistic view and the intuition to figure out the next best path. So I think that makes complete sense. The other kind of way to we think about it is abstraction layer. Same thing in the programming language. If you're coding assembly or whatnot, you're operating at a very, very low level. That's probably very helpful in terms of gaining efficiency around your code. But for you to have a greater impact in terms of scale, you gotta move yourself up to the higher order or a more of an abstraction layer in terms of the programming languages. And I think it's kind of similar in the organization, whether it be people management or as a technical leadership. If you're escalating yourself into the next layer of abstraction layer, by whether it be working through people or working through frameworks, new tools out there that gives you more leverage and productivity, then you can kind of, even as a senior engineer, you can kind of have a bigger, broader scale of impact by moving yourself up in the layer of abstraction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned something there too that I do want to, probably is close to a cheat code, I guess, that's worth mentioning, which is working on internal tools when the company is very, very small is this unglamorous and gritty activity, right? So if you're the CI person, you learn a bunch about Jenkins or whatever, and you keep the darn thing running when it's just 4 of you. And it's just one of these messy, toilets that's got to be cleaned as part of keeping things running. When it's 1,000 people, suddenly everything you do is very, very leveraged throughout the company, for good or for bad. So really excellent people who are really eager to have a kind of an outsized impact on everybody else's productivity. If you save 1% of every engineer's day, if you're at a 1,000-person company, that's the easiest way I know of to be a 10x engineer in a very literal sense, right?
Yep. Makes a lot of sense. By the way, as we get to the closing of the hour, we'll try to do some like fast round of questions, 60-second answers. But I think there's just wonderful list of questions in here. I can kind of go from the top here. So like, what do you see as some of the top, key responsibility and value for architect level positions versus, let's say, a senior engineer? So what is the new, new, good, bad, and different? What are the things that are different when you become like the architect level? I'm actually quite curious about that too.
Right. So in my experience so far, let's see. One of the things that I think surprised me is how much less power you have as an architect, like how much less control over real outcomes you have. So at some level, your contributions become sort of more editorial and less like a director. If you'll like take a film analogy there, there is so much going on and so many people that have so much more context about their field of technology, what's happening in their code base, what their goals are for the year and so on, that your role becomes sort of more about maintaining some kind of coherence around what everything's doing, making sure some group over here isn't sabotaging some group over there unintentionally, as opposed to sort of having a vision and building a plan to execute that singular vision. And that can be, there's ups and downs about that, right? There's just good and bad about that. It's just very different.
Yeah, and I think once people, especially elevate in their career trajectory, I think part of what becomes even more important is just communication overall. What you're working on, what is your vision, and what is your roadmap? So how do you like approach that question around or skills around communication? How do you tell stories to increase your, I guess, influence and effectiveness as a technical leader?
Right. Yeah. So I think a huge challenge for people, even, and this starts at the tech lead role, by the way. By the time you're a tech lead of a sizable team, I think you should spend almost about half your time communicating. And that is communicating externally, right? Communicating to the people that are going to use the stuff you're building, whether that's internal or external. It's bringing back feedback from them into your team, right? So communicating from the outside world in, explaining what the problems people are having with your thing is in a way that the people on your team are going to hear it and be able to respond to it reasonably. Making plans within your team, expressing those plans to your customer teams. I think you have to have some sort of clear idea of where you sit in the stack and be able to kind of enumerate, the people that are your customers and the people that you are customers of. And those are all kind of relationships that you have to actively manage. Those are all relationships that require sort of some effort. And in terms of doing that in a scalable way and doing it in a way that sticks, I have found no better view of this than storytelling. And this is literally the sort of Joseph Campbell, here with 1,000 faces style storytelling about what your team is doing. Your team needs a story about itself. And you may think as a technologist, people often find that sort of unsatisfying somehow because you're dealing with bits and bytes and, speeds and feeds and your goal is to improve performance by 3% at P99. Why are we talking about a story? The problem there is just that you're still a human being and everybody on your team is still a human being. And there's just a story-shaped hole in their heads. Like they want to be living in a story and they will make one up for themselves if there's not a better one available. And a lot of times the stories are really crappy if you're forced to make it up by yourself in your spare time. Like the story will be that our CEO is an idiot and so he doesn't understand what we're doing and so he's making us do this thing that doesn't make any sense. Or, that our customers are fools and they insist on this thing that won't actually help them. And so we're making, so you need to kind of have something that's at least like a better story, a more satisfying story to be part of than those to tell internally and externally. And that is, a whole world, right? There's people who devote their lives to storytelling. But at the bottom, to be clear, I really want there to be a beginning and a middle and an end and protagonists and antagonists and, some management of the tension, right? To some extent, when people talk about burnout, they're talking about crappy pacing in the story they're living, right? They're talking about sort of being stuck at some weird part of the story that never changes. So that's whole other kind of long topic that I owe you a better written explanation of at some point. I gave a talk about this at San Francisco Engineering Leadership Conference once, if you got a half hour to burn on it.
Great. There you go, folks. Check it out. This question is kind of interesting. Does the programming community view technical track as a viable long-term career path? Where are all the 50-year-old programmers? And I actually want to ask you, what do you see yourself doing when you're like 50? Do you see yourself being a chief architect? Are you programming? What are you doing?
That's a really great question. Yeah, that's a really great question. So I'm between things now, and very explicitly, am not sure what my next career step is. And it's there's certainly like a life script that says it should be founding something. There's a different one that says, oh, you should go be a CTO somewhere. There's sipping daiquiris on a beach until I die, I guess, is a possibility, which is weird. I think without trying to extrapolate too much for myself, so I do have some friends who are still working engineers who are older, a decade or two older than myself. These are folks that were mentors for me early in my career. They encounter some real ageism, right? Like some of the things that they encounter are pretty straightforward instances of like, we're uncomfortable with having somebody write code for a living in their 50s and 60s. So that is part of the headwind that people start to face in that as they progress. There's, there is a steady trickle of people into the management track. And despite what we were saying earlier, the stickiness of management and engineering is non-zero, right? Like there is a little bit of a valve, like there's a little bit of a partial pressure that kind of sucks people off towards management at some rate. And even if it's only sort of 1% a year, by the time you get 30 or 40 years into a career, that's really, it's going to be the majority of people, even if it's a very subtle effect. And I think there's at least a perception, and on some people, a first-person feeling that it gets harder to throw out what you knew and learn all the new stuff as quickly as all the kids are learning all the new stuff as you get older. Now, I'm going to cop to this. I'm 43, or about to turn 43. I feel like I've lost a step, right? Like when I go and like read code that I wrote when I was 22 or something, or when I go and read a patent that I filed while I was still at VMware or something, there is definitely this voice of me that says, goodness, how the heck did I ever get my head around all that stuff and build this thing that actually worked? So I know why some older programmers feel that way. I will also say, I remember feeling that way when I was 22. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's more an effect of sort of looking back on work you did without context than it is real cognitive headwinds. And my lived experience as a programmer is that, at least so far, my having more experience to draw on and more patterns to match is a stronger effect than, whatever kind of raw steps I might be missing. And I'm not a cognitive psychologist, so I can't tell you like what aging changes that way. But there's at least like a social story that people buy into internally that says, I don't have the horsepower I used to have. And so I don't want to continue progressing along this path because I've lost a step or something.
Speaking of cognitive psychology, I think there's an interesting study on this is, there's a thing called Big Five Factor model. It's like one of those models that are most valid and reliable in terms of modern psychology. And one of the factors is called agreeableness, where people become a little bit more compassionate. And I think what happens, especially is statistically, as people age over time, their level of agreeableness goes up, meaning you become a little bit more compassionate. You become a little bit more human focused. Which is probably not the most common way for an engineer to start out their career. So people actually sometimes naturally gravitate more towards having a higher interest in people. And I think that might also be a factor in terms of that valve you mentioned earlier. So quite interesting.
Yeah, that could easily be. I think they get less neurotic too. That might be a factor as well.
Yep.
Speaking of the 5 factors.
We've
I definitely
kind of been there, done that kind of situation. You become less neurotic. Okay, I've seen this movie before.
And definitely early in my career, I know that I was driven by a sense that like I had something to prove, and I don't feel that way anymore. So um, we'll see how
Very
that
cool.
plays out.
Very cool. And there are a couple of questions that I want to weave together here. It's like as this kind of career tracks, I call it bifurcate. There's like a technical track, leadership track, then there's a people manager track. But I think in high resolution, companies slightly differ. Some say, hey, even if you're like a people manager, you still need to have a bigger influence on the engineering decision side of things. They're kind of blurring the line a little bit, where some companies say, hey, you're a people leader. So coach, mentor, focus on reviews and all that. Whereas let the kind of senior, whatever technical leader side of things calls the shots on the technical decisions. So what do you think is the right balance there or
Yeah.
philosophy there?
I've experienced like both extremes, honestly, and both can work. I'm not sure I understand quite what the path dependent physics of like the company cultures that where one works where the other versus the other. If you're in a managers or people managers company, it's really hard to buck that trend, and vice versa. Like I think you need to kind of blend in with whatever your company's doing. In terms of my personal, teams I worked on personally, I was usually in some sort of tech lead role where I had an understanding, where I have to work really hand in hand with the team's manager. And by the way, if you are a tech lead, you need to have a great relationship with your team's manager, I believe. And usually, like on the teams I was on, I had an understanding that like I was going to be responsible for the technical side of things, and the people manager person was going to be much more responsible for having hard conversations, hiring and firing, recruiting for the team. Some of the internal comm stuff I was talking about before. So in terms of my personal preference, I probably lean more towards like having people managers. There's this myth I think around managers that programmers won't respect you unless they like think you're strictly better than them, or at least that's a feeling I think a lot of first time managers have, is that like if they are not the coolest kid in school, why will anybody take them seriously? And the answer is just like that's just not how it is. Like they understand that you have a role to play, and will let you play that role if you do it with sort of confidence and compassion and in a reasonable way. I've never felt like I needed my manager to be able to outdo me in everything I was doing.
Yeah, I think that kind of relates to the question here is like, how deep do you go? Because as you continue to scale the organization and you have like 10 different responsibility, sometimes you feel like you lost grasp on the code or specific language or the domain expertise in certain fields. Like, how do you manage that breadth versus depth, and how do you, I guess, wrap your head around that?
Yeah. Well, okay, so that's a great question. I think actually shipping stuff is a great forcing function for depth, right? So I do think that's one of the ways to avoid sort of dilettantism, right? If you just sort of pick a little from here and a little from there all the time, is to actually have to deliver things and keep them working. That sort of forces you to be at least as deep as you need to be for some real world use case. That's actually one of the reasons I love the industrial setting, honestly, right? Like I've never been super tempted by academia just because it feels like you never really know whether you did something or not, right? You never, put it to the test of sort of creating economic value directly, right? So I think that sort of using that as a depth anchor is handy. And I think different people have different proclivities. I think I'm drawn towards breadth naturally. I think I would tend to like flit around from thing to thing if I didn't have any other pressures on me. So I like having that to anchor me. There are people who are naturally depth first, right? There are people who would super happily just go further and further out on the same branch forever and ever and ever. And they probably need to have a little lasso that, tugs them back towards exploring a little bit some of the time. And that can come in lots of different ways. A thing that I thought was sort of mildly successful at this at Facebook was there just was a culture around changing teams every once in a while. There was broadly an expectation that like if you spent your whole career at Facebook, like it wasn't going to be on the same team. But even that had exceptions if you were a specialist in databases or compilers or something like that. So it's tough to say.
That's really interesting because it's almost like a forcing function of increasing the divergence through systems. And I think you mentioned you like to go breadth first. It also kind of shows that maybe your openness towards other areas of the business or other areas of the technical field. And some people are naturally gravitate more towards convergence or divergence. So I think in your case, you're kind of more that explorer mindset which gave you that insight into different kind of fields. I actually wanted to ask this question myself, but I'll merge it with my own. Is any kind of book recommendation, but like how do you, not just the books, how do you find your mentors? How do you get advice, quality advice? Because there are a lot of advice sites out there. So whether it be books, mentors, how do you get those right resources?
Yeah. So the folks that I'm looking to for advice these days are people that were, ahead of me on the paths I was on earlier in my career, a lot like all of you. So these were folks that were more senior than me at VMware and Facebook. Not at Slack because I was in closer to sort of a terminal position at Slack, right? And they're still out there, right? So if that question before about like, well, where do the 60-year-olds go? I mean, some of them are kind of angel investors, and it's hard to put your finger on what it is they do exactly, right? I'm not sure what Jeff Rothschild puts on his IRS form for occupation, right? But it's some version of advisor, investor, operator, I guess, right? I think those relationships that you're forming, that the mentor-mentee relationships on both sides that have been most valuable to me, like the big test for them is when you leave the company. Right? And the relationships that you keep that turn out not to be contingent on we're working at the same place, right? Where it turns out that like I like you so much and I'm so invested in your career and so invested in how you develop as a person that we're going to keep having coffee and keep talking about the problems you're having no matter what. Those are kind of the ones that, if they survive that initial 6-month washing out of the place kind of period, are really durable and really rewarding, at least for me. We're on a platform that Plato gave us, so like I do want to kind of acknowledge that like that's a new force, right? It's a new force in my life. I haven't been able to test any of those relationships over the course of years. It'll be interesting to see if that ends up being kind of a major new place these things come from. I think if it's not Plato, it'll be someone. And the books question, I actually wanted to make a few notes about this because like I'm peculiar about this. So even though we're talking about ACs here, probably the most practically impactful book on my career I read in the last couple of years was Camille Fournier's The Manager's Path.
Manager's
and
Path?
It's by Camille Fournier. Mm-hmm. And she's writing there specifically for an audience of people who are sort of transitioning into managing or moving along the management track. But your partnership with managers and your understanding of what managers do and your ability to kind of read management situations, at least in my experience, does inevitably get more important as you become a more senior IC as well. That book name is The Manager's Path. And that's by Camille Fournier. Her last name is Fourn. Yeah, somebody's got it. Great.
Yep.
Two very different ones than that. And these are much less about practicality, much more about just motivation, staying excited about computing. Stripe Press just released this book called The Making of the Prince of Persia by Jordan Mechner.
Yep.
It was the solo auteur of this video game from the 80s. Had a very strong, a lot of sense memories for me from that game because I played that game as a kid. But it's just a great book about the kind of winding paths that something in the real world came to be in. And another one that I'm always surprised, this is a little bit going to date me here because people don't read this very much anymore, but Tracy Kidder's Soul of a New Machine, which is a book about sort of development of a mini computer in the late 70s and early 80s. But it's just a great sort of, human description of what's exciting about bringing something new into the world. And if you've never read it, it's an exciting thing to read. I envy you if you're reading it for the first time. Big fan of it. I periodically reread that one. That's one I actually go back to every 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, and I think kind of, I guess using the book, The Manager's Path, as stepping stones. So there's a lot of questions. I've been scrolling through some of the Q&As here, and there's a lot of questions about people struggling with finding the partnership between the people manager track and the specialist track, all the way to the top as a CTO and chief architect. And as you trickle down to, or trickle up, depending on which org chart you use, reverse pyramid or on that, at a director level, how do you build a partnership between the people managers and the specialists? How do you make the decision process work? And also among the other director levels of your peers, how do you get the partnership going? So there's a lot of inquiries around that kind of the horizontal or lateral partnership if that makes sense. Love to get your thoughts there.
Yeah. Um, Gosh.
It's a big question.
Yeah, it is. So it's human complete, right? Those are all human relationships, and so they're going to be specific to the director that you're actually trying to build a partnership with, her strengths or weaknesses, what she wants to get out of it, the things her team's trying to get done, how that overlaps with expertise, all kinds of things. The two in a box with a CTO thing, like I did have a lot of experience with that. Slack has a very strong, very visible CTO, Cal Henderson, who's a founder. And sort of founders, in scaled up startups, founders have a kind of social capital that is just minted in a different coin than other people have, right? It's not like he was 100 times more influential than me or something. It's just he was playing a different game than me in terms of his social influence and organizational influence, right? He's able to set the culture in a way that just nobody else can. So your partnership with the CTO is going to vary, but I can tell you about sort of some mistakes we made early on, right? So very early on, it was good enough for me and Cal just be kind of like, yeah, you're Cal, you're a reasonable person. I'm Keith, I'm a reasonable person. We respect each other. We're both really smart. We both know a lot of the same stuff and, whatever. A thing that eventually started happening was that people, and I don't think this was maliciously intended, but people internalized some model of sort of my aesthetics and Cal's aesthetics and the difference between them. And since it wasn't sort of super well defined, like how decisions got made, they'd sort of take Keithy things to Keith for me to say yes to, and Callie things to Cal for Cal to say yes to. And this would become a source of conflict between me and Cal, right? Like I would show up to work one day and I'd be like, you greenlit this thing that why wouldn't you talk to me about that? Why do you think this is a good idea? Or vice versa, right? Like he'd be upset with me because I greenlit something that sort of fit my preconceptions, right? And that was when we sort of started realizing like, oh, we probably need to sort of draw some clearer boundaries around which kind of decision is yours and which kind of decision is mine. So, that was survivable, luckily, but it did cause some heartache and some tension. I think figuring out when the right time to do that is an art, not a science. I think, there's an anti-pattern here, which is like drawing a line down the middle of the dorm room, right? The anti-pattern here is being like, okay, everything on that side is yours and everything on this side is mine, and we're going to get really pissed at each other if you cross the line and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You got to have some human flexibility around this stuff if you're going to have those roles coexist.
That's very interesting because on the business side of the world too, there are roles like, CEO, COO, CFO, chief of staff. And one thing that I heard from like the YC, Y Combinator growth program was that every company has a slightly different COO. It's almost like augmenting the CEO's role in a way. So you have to find a fluid boundary instead of trying to say, hey, this domain area is owned by this. Then that will actually create a less optimal state because everyone has different strength. And at that level, there's so many 10 different business areas that you might have to own. So I think there's probably an analogy in that when it comes to building the relationship with the CTO and the chief architect, and even the other layers within the organization. I know
that feels true.
I know we're almost at time. There's a lot of great questions in there that we couldn't get to today. But if you had top 3 advice that you want to give to the future chief architects, the future senior principal engineers, what would be the 3 advice for them to continue to make progress in their career?
Interesting. So 1, stay technical. Right. So don't give up, even though there sort of seems like there's 40 hours a week of PowerPoint to write and read. Try and stay technical. And that's going to mean different things for different folks. I think at the same time that you do that, improving your literacy and sort of empathy for what it is that managers do is going to be really important. So, become as good a manager as you can without becoming a manager. And then if we had to keep it down to 3, perhaps as a counterweight to stay technical, know what your business does, right? Like know where the value flow actually is, right? Where does the money come in and where does it go, and how can you actually affect that? Because even at the individual contributor level, there's often really big levers there. Even a modestly sized business, making a 1% improvement at that kind of chunk is going to get noticed very, very quickly. And a lot of times individual contributors don't realize that that's true, don't realize that. And Amar is asking, can I elaborate on the second one, please? Be as good a manager as you can without being a manager. You need to spend time with these folks. You need to build relationships with them. You need to understand why their jobs are freaking impossible. You need to kind of appreciate how, reading some books about what they do, like that Fournier book recommended before, I think is a worthwhile use of your time. Because there are, so in a role as a chief architect, right, it's very tempting to be like, well, why didn't you guys deliver the widget the quarter you said you'd deliver the widget? And it is super hard to really have an empathetic understanding of the answer to that. If you literally have no idea what managers do, which it's possible to do, right? It's possible to have a career as a computer programmer and have an only very abstract idea of what managers spend their time doing.
Great. Well, it was really exciting to have you as our guest and learn a lot and really enjoyed this conversation. So
yeah, likewise, Sean. Thank you. Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Yeah, in the last kind of 30 seconds that we have, John, awesome job moderating. Thanks so much. I want to thank Senbird for co-hosting this with us. And then in case you don't know, once again, if you are looking for a really great chat API, look at Senbird. And then finally, for Keith, just want to say thanks so much. Thanks for just dropping tons of knowledge, just helping all the engineers out there. We actually had over 300 people join us today. So that's super exciting. And then also we'll be sending out an email with a video recording, a recap in case you want to watch it or and your engineering team wants to watch it. And then finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're looking for more senior engineers to become mentors in our community, just because we have so much demand now for mentorship from engineers who want to grow. So yeah, if you know any senior engineers or if you yourself are interested in being a mentor, we'd love to hear from you. So that's about it from me. Again, thanks, John. Thanks, Keith. Everyone, stay safe, wash your hands, and we will see you next time. We'll see you next week. Take care.
Take care, guys.